Okay, so hello everyone. Before we get started, I would like to quickly mention that this session today will be simultaneously translated into Spanish, and you can choose to listen in Spanish by using the little globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. But now, welcome to the third edition of Radical Diversity. After stops in Los Angeles and Houston, we're very excited to be bringing the discussion series to Seattle today. My name is Arabelle Liepold, and I'm the director of the Goethe Pop-Up here in Seattle, which is a temporary branch of Germany's Goethe-Institut. In this series, Radical Diversity, we discuss strategies to a more open, diverse, and just society in Germany and the US. The series is presented by several Goethe-Institut locations in North America in collaboration with the Goethe Pop-Ups, the Thomas Mann House, the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity, and it's sponsored by the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in North America. In today's session, our host Mohamed Amjahid will discuss questions of liminality and safer spaces for artists, activists, and communities in gentrified neighborhoods with key members of Seattle's arts and culture sector. Mohamed is a political reporter for the weekly German newspapers Die Zeit and Zeit Magazin, and he studied political science in Berlin and Cairo, and conducted research on various anthropological projects in North America. Mohamed focuses on human rights, equality, and upheaval in the US, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And in 2017, Mohamed wrote the book, Among Whites, What It Means to Be Privileged. Mohamed is also a Thomas Mann Fellow and would usually be in Los Angeles right now, but he's joining us today from Berlin. And before I hand over the floor to Mohamed, just a few quick webinar housekeeping items. I'm sure you're mostly familiar with it, but today's webinar is scheduled to last 90 minutes, including the Q&A. All participants will be muted, but we encourage you to please submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window at any time, and then we will try to get to as many questions as possible in the third part of this session, so an hour from now. But please already start thinking about questions as we go ahead. The session is going to get recorded, and we will be making it available via our YouTube channel later on, and we'll keep you updated on that. But now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Mohamed. Thank you, Mohamed.
Thank you, Arabelle, so much, and thank you to Goethe Pop-Up for hosting us this time. And I'm so pleased that we can talk today about urban politics, protest, in the city and liminality between Seattle and Berlin. First of all, I would like to introduce our three amazing panelists. Elisheba Johnson is a curator, public artist, and administrator. She currently co-manages Wa Na Wari, a center for Black art and culture in Seattle's historically red-lined Central District that uses the arts to build community and resist displacement and gentrification. Charles Mudede is a Zimbabwean-born cultural critic, urbanist, and writer for the New York Times and LA Weekly. He's currently associate editor for The Stranger, Seattle's bi-weekly alternative newspaper. He's also a filmmaker whose newest feature, The Skin, premiered this summer. Rana San is an artist and arts administrator who, prior to stepping into her current role as artistic director at Seattle's Northwest Film Forum, served as its community programmer. Drawing on her background in performing arts and cultural management, she crafts collective experiences that elevate the work of artists and activists, using film, media, and contemporary performing arts to cultivate intimacy and inside connection. Welcome to all of you. I'm so happy to see you, meet you all. Hopefully in the future we can see each other also in person. For the beginning, I have a very personal and simple question. If you could share with us your favorite political space or place in the city as an activist, as an artist, as an author. And of course, I would then also, before I share my favorite space in Berlin, I would also like to hear why you chose that specific place in Seattle. Maybe we begin with Elisheba.
Oh, okay.
Ta-da!
Also, just thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. That's a hard question.
Me, it's a simple question.
And I've been thinking about it since you gave us the primer a few minutes ago. And I think my answer would be, I think a lot about in the civil rights movement, people talked about how a lot of folks were actually in community, breaking bread, eating together. And then when it was time to organize, they already had those relationships. And so I don't know if it's like an actual physical space. There are spaces that have a lot of political history in Seattle. But I think for me personally, a few friends of mine, we started a susu, which is a West African tradition of pooling money. And through that, we started doing mutual aid this year in 2020. And it also has become an informal organizing group. So I think of home spaces or the spaces where we get together to gather are also the spaces where we authentically and organically organize.
Great. Thank you for that. Maybe if Rana would like to share her ideas.
Sure, and I'm not going to satisfy your need for a space specifically either, Mohamed, because I had a similar reaction to this question as Elisheba, in terms of my roots and connections to community around political organizing are not tied to a specific space. It's really about the bodies in the space together, and when we come together, the conversations that can flourish and that can evolve, and the capacity, the ability to have those types of gatherings. And those happen in really different environments for me. They can be community-driven cultural festivals. They can be community brunches. They can be creative salons that are hosted in someone's home. The space and four-wall structure that hosts those types of gatherings is always forever shifting. And I think the most important part for me is who's in the room and who's able to have those conversations.
Thank you. And Charles, you're still muted?
There we go. Yeah, no, I actually do have a place that's interesting. I think in terms of like an area, and it's where my office used to be. We just recently moved out of certain blocks of in Capitol Hill that I think gravitate around Cal Anderson Park. I'm interested in this area for a number of reasons. One is, of course, we had the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and there's the flourishing of art and the political activism recently. And it's in confrontation with certain developments in that neighborhood. Capitol Hill itself, part of it still holds not too far away from where Chaz was, is an old, if not the oldest traditional Black American church in Seattle. If I'm correct, it's the AME. I might be wrong about that, but there are other sort of significant institutions of that kind that have been sort of, they're still there, but often isolated because of gentrification. But their history is still present to me in that area. And it also, that area is where a lot of cultural institutions still operate, such as Northwest Film Forum and Hugo House, a literary center, and so forth. That's around the park Cal Anderson, which is named after the first openly gay politician at the state level. Cal Anderson was his name, and so there's that as well. And then there's this older tradition of being a sort of gay neighborhood as well, and for many years, and gentrification sort of broke that apart, and so there's that other history as well. So to me, there's a lot of things that are going on there that are still developing and also unresolved. And it's this unresolved aspect that makes it interesting for me. And also there's the police station, the fabulous, wonderful, barricaded police station. It was the first police station in our city to actually build a wall around itself. I am so proud of Seattle. We got a police station to actually build concrete blocks, a whole wall to keep people out. So what kind of policing that is also unknown at this present time.
Maybe we can have like a cliffhanger here and tell the people who are watching later the story behind this police station. And I would like to talk also about Carl Anderson Park later, because I think it's a very interesting space. But very briefly, it's very weird that I ask a question. I would myself not be able to answer it. Like also Rana said, it's not about four walls, actually, because I was in the last couple of days thinking a lot about this question and what would I choose in Berlin. And I don't have a specific space or place, actually. It's, as you all three said, it's, I guess, also about ideas, about people you want to connect with and you want to share something with, like the project Susu, was it called? I know it from Morocco, this kind of community building and neighborhood exchange. So in Berlin, I was thinking that it's all the spaces where I even don't know the people, but I see people who I instantly somehow connect to them only by knowing that we shouldn't be there. It's like wherever I see a black or brown person, and we know not all black and brown folks are like good, amazing people, because it's not a monolithic group. But when I go somewhere and I don't see a group which is homogeneous, and this space they are decision makers, and you have like a very interesting conversation, that's like what I like. And then we have, of course, like the places where you can go and party and have a good time here in Berlin, but now in Corona times that's a little bit difficult. Before we talk about, for example, the Carl Anderson Park, I wanted to speak about the possibilities to come together in Seattle. I was doing some research about the housing situation in the city. Someone just mentioned home spaces, which are very important for all of us. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I found several sources where I had the information that the median home price in Seattle is now $760,000. The average rent for one apartment in Seattle, or for an apartment in Seattle, is $2,169. 2,169. That's a lot. According to mynorthwest.com, Seattle rent prices are among the highest in the entire country. And according to the Seattle Magazine, coronavirus has cost more than 100,000 people around Seattle their jobs, leaving them struggling with paying for housing, either buying or renting. Most affected communities are low-income families and already marginalized people, Black folks, and people of color. And my question is, talking also about the organization of your own work, how is this housing crisis affecting your personal life, but also the surroundings where you exchange with other people?
Who wants to go first?
I was like, who wants to go first? All right, I'll go first. The obvious pick. Yeah, so I'm a born and raised Seattleite. My parents bought their home in 1980 for about $35,000. That house is now valued at $1 million.
Wow.
And so I have been priced out personally in the city. I think it's the last 20 years in particular is when the housing rates have really risen. Seattle has got a very particular reason why our housing is the way it is, with a lot of our tech companies and biotech companies that have come into the area, but also us providing kind of a better quality of life. So there were people moving. We have a lot of people that have moved from Silicon Valley up to Seattle that were working in the tech industry because they felt like they would be. It's actually more affordable here than there, and access to green spaces and things like that. So what you have seen is some of our historically redline neighborhoods, like the Central District, have experienced increased gentrification. But some of that is also due to city policy. So I always want to talk about, I always want to make sure people understand structural racism and how that works. So there are communities in Seattle that are kind of NIMBY communities that have made sure that some of these kind of policies around what we call there's MHA, which I can't remember what it stands for, basically, but there's some policy that came around 20 years ago that made it where developers could go into neighborhoods like the Central District and build high-rise apartments and become very dense. And the density wasn't necessarily about providing space for Black and brown folks, but for actually pro-developer and bringing in a lot of these tech workers or the highest market rate apartments. So what we're seeing now is really, really dense parts of our neighborhoods. And then, and like I said, some neighborhoods where the single family whiteness is protected. So the project I work on, particularly Wa Na Wari, is in a 5th generation Black owned home in Seattle Central District. And we're 4 artists who rent the space. It's Inye Wakoma's grandparents' home. And Inye is one of the 4 founders. And we rent it as supporting of keeping a Black homeowner in that neighborhood, and then give it back to the Black community as an arts and cultural space. So there's lots of loss when communities are broken up. And one of those things is that people don't have, they come back to the neighborhood for various reasons, to see family, et cetera. But a lot of the landmarks and cultural institutions are gone. Some have just not been able to make it. Some have moved south. And so we think it's really important to provide a space that is safe for Black people to feel whole in themselves, to see themselves. And so that is what we try to do with the arts and cultural programming. But I'll leave it to somebody else now.
Yeah,
I can jump in or follow up on that. So I'm also Seattle born and raised. I actually grew up between continents, so I split my years between Istanbul and Seattle. But I am living in the house that I grew up in, actually. I had the great fortune of finding my way back here, and I'm living in Ballard right now. I used to live in Capitol Hill, definitely got priced out like a decade ago, and I have worked on and around Capitol Hill for the last decade. So there was this sort of shift at that time as I was trying to find my place personally as an artist and as an arts administrator, trying to land someplace that corresponded to where I was working. And that hasn't happened yet. So I think that's a very true reality, that the majority of arts organizers in the city are likely commuting long distances to get to where they're actually working and spending most of their waking hours. Obviously, this is pre-pandemic. I've been in my home for the last 6 months. So things look a little bit different now. But I think in terms of the housing crisis affecting you individually, affecting us as organizers individually, that's a very real consideration, that we're not necessarily living in the environments and neighborhoods and communities in which, or personally, at least for me, that's true, that I'm not living in the community that I spend the majority of my time serving and collaborating with. And then organizationally, for Northwest Film Forum, we're situated in Capitol Hill, a historically, brilliantly colorful, queer, vibrant space that has become one of the victims of the tech boom, unfortunately. And so what's happening is we're seeing a lot of people with a lot of money moving into the neighborhood without an understanding or connection to the historical significance of the institutions that have existed there, and of the cultural relevance of those institutions, especially in the arts. And so artists who used to live and work and make work and present work out of Capitol Hill have been pushed out. And it's not, what I've been seeing especially is not just they're getting pushed out to different parts of the city, but they're actually leaving Seattle. They're moving to places like LA because LA is somehow more affordable and has more opportunities for them than Seattle does in their work. And this is discouraging from the standpoint of an arts organization who really exists to champion the diversity of art, especially in moving image media and visual storytelling in our community. And it's really discouraging when our artists decide the city cannot serve them and that they have to move to be able to exist, to be able to survive. So those are some of the things that play for us right now.
Yeah. So Seattle is no different than a lot of cities around the world that have no capital controls at all, that have no kind of regulation or regulatory framework for housing or for the movement of investments, so-called investments. We're completely wide open for speculative, adventurism, and that's been the case at least for the past 10 years. That's accelerated, and so in a sense, there was this idea that somehow the tech boom was pushing or putting or inflating housing values, and that there's some truth in that. But if you look at the relationship between the size of the housing market, the way that it's just grown and grown, and compared to say what the earnings or the incomes, you'll find that there's a complete disconnect. And so even with high incomes, that does not entirely explain this rapid increase in property values around the city. Right now, if you earn somewhere around $50,000, you cannot live in the city, which is a strange thing to say. That would be considered a middle class income. And there's a large group that earns about $100,000 a year, right? Considerable portion of the economy has that claim on income, but still, that's not enough for a lot of people to make not to be rent burdened or so forth and so on. So you have to consider, well, what's going on. And I think what happened in Seattle is what happened in Vancouver, what's happened in New York City, Manhattan particularly, and what happened in London. The notion that there were high incomes was used to increase values and therefore make profits, and on excessive speculation, and it was unleashed and nobody checked it. And so we're stuck in the situation where we have a market, a housing market that corresponds to the global rich, but not even to the local rich, right? It corresponds to this wider, deeper pocket. And so there's a disconnect on one side. And it seems like we're not going to prevent it. And I suspect eventually we're going to get that point where the houses around here are nothing but placements, as they call them in French, or assets, financial assets. And so they don't have to be lived in. This happened in Vancouver, BC, where there's tons of properties that are empty, but are just sat on because that's where people park their money and that sort of stuff. This started in Seattle. It's not. We haven't even done a proper investigation into the effects of this kind of practice. But right now, you have this bizarre situation where actually this was even before the pandemic hit. You had a lot of small businesses closing. We're not even going to the arts community. We can just start with restaurants closing left, right, and center that they can't afford. The rent they blame, and then politically they blame homelessness, crime, and all that sort of stuff on it. But nobody seems to talk like, how do you run a business in the city, a small business particularly, when there's no checks on rent, there's no monitoring, there's no regulation, there's nothing at all. And so I'm predicting a situation where basically we're going to have a lot of empty business spaces and a city that's still thriving in terms of growth, economic growth. So we're going to have economic growth without an economy at the base. And so this is the city. And right now, today, the news came out a few days ago that we're back again having the most cranes up in the air in the USA. Seattle downtown is virtually empty. How that is, where this money's coming from is a big question. We haven't looked into it, but here we are. We're expanding with no real growth at all. And so this is not. I don't think this is exceptional. I think it's just what happens when we don't have the legal framework for protecting. I know right now in Berlin, they did step in to put a cap on rents, but we're nowhere near that politically. I mean, everything that we do seems to be shot down, and we're just left to to migrate further south or leave the town altogether. I'm only lucky because I bought a house back in 1997 when I earned about $30,000 a year, and I could still afford a house in Seattle at the time. And um, and um, all those properties are now going towards becoming $1 million homes. And that's just a fact of the matter. But there's no, what I try to explain to you, there's no supply and demand issue here. There is an inflation that is caused by unchecked global flows of capital from around the world, not just, I mean, from around the world, around the country, and so forth and so on. And wherever they can make money, or where they can talk up a good story about, say, the tech boom, if they can show that as Seattle is the center of that, if they can do, then they'll inflate it even further. So it's not even, it doesn't stop with matching the demand from the tech sector. It just grows and grows and grows. So right now, most houses, yes, they're probably going towards 800,000. They're still increasing during the pandemic. And so our city becomes a lot like the disconnect on the stock market, where there's no, where small businesses are crumbling, but these larger sort of investment corporations are expanding at almost like the universe at a more rapid speed as they expand.
It's super interesting because, first of all, the CAP initiative of the city council here in Berlin, it's challenged in the courts, and landlords, they are putting now two prices in a new contract, saying in case we will be able again to just take any amount of money from you, you have to pay then this price. So also the market is adapting to new regulations, but it's super interesting to just observe that there are like similar tendencies, because in the last 5 years in Berlin, we had a rise of 44% in the rent market, 44% more rent in the last only 5 years. This is also due to privatization. In the beginning of the 2000s, actually, the city government started to just sell the public buildings, public housing to profit companies, and now one of the most profitable and biggest companies in Germany, which is listed in the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, name is Deutsche Wohnen, owns most of the buildings here in the city. But at the same time, there's flow of this capital, but there's this flow of humans, actually. And the worst thing that could happen to you as someone who rents an apartment in Berlin is that one of these companies buy your house. But the second worst thing that could happen to you is that artists from the US come and move in next door, because this is like a sign that something is happening. These people, and I met once a group, and they were from all over the US, some of them also from Seattle. They are used to pay $2,000 in rent, and they're ready to do this in Berlin. So here you can see that it's connected, actually, and it's very interesting that you describe something that you cannot. It's not only, if I understood it right, not only about living but also working in the city, right? I don't know, Elisheba, you told us about your project to claim a space back or to bring it back. Can you maybe elaborate? How is it possible to still occupy some space in the city where you are not supposed to be if you don't have the money?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think Rana and Charles touched on a lot of really important things. So another thing to really understand historically about Seattle is, like, again, people moved here because they could be working artists and still afford a place to live. So back in the 90s, when your favorite bands were coming out, somebody could literally work at a coffee shop and pay their bills and then be in a band. And now with the rising cost of rent, people are quitting their cultural practices. So I know lots of artists who just quit making visual art because they can't afford a studio space, or they can't afford materials and things like that. And so a lot of what was unique about Seattle is we're losing the soul of actually who we are. I think a lot of these companies that have moved in, they're the people that work there, I'm not trying to be judgmental, but I think there's been lots of articles written about this, is that tech is more of a insular type of field. And so what we've seen is like a rise of restaurants across Seattle and a decrease of our cultural institutions. It's been, so that money, even though it's coming into the city, is not flowing to our theater organizations, our dance organizations, our visual arts organizations, right? So there's a small group of people that are frequenting those, that have always frequented those, but the new people are not coming to those. And then it is highly prohibited to have actually a restaurant in the city, because we also don't have an income tax. So there's a lot of other taxes that are placed either on our small businesses or on our homeowners through property tax. So there's a lot of pressures that make it hard for people to live here. But to your point, Wa Na Wari is very much about what does it mean to reclaim space at market rate rent. So we pay $3,000 a month to make sure that the homeowner is able to stay in their home, which is a lot of money to me. For a space, but that's what the market bears for a house of that size in the Central District. Obviously, we're a nonprofit, so we use, we get money from our individual donors and grants and stuff like that, and use that to pay it. But we also use that as an opportunity to explain to people, this is how hard it is for people to be able to stay in this neighborhood. But yeah, we're, especially with coronavirus, we're seeing, there was a statewide survey that just came out a couple of weeks ago that we 85% of our arts organizations are going to run out of cash by the end of this month. And so I don't think it will just be, like Charles said, a bunch of empty businesses. There'll be a bunch of empty arts organizations as well.
Rana, do you want to comment on that? Because I imagine also for your projects with this pandemic, it might be hard to sustain or just to pay the bills.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a really multi-layered issue. For us, our physical space is located in Capitol Hill. It was within the Capitol Hill occupied protest area. And we're doors down from the fortress that is the East Precinct right now. So our space is one of our biggest assets. We have a gorgeous 2-theater space. They're 2 small intimate theaters, but a large lobby. We have an edit lab. We offer gear rental for as part of our artist services to our community. And so there are a lot of resources that are just physically tied to that space that we're using as that we're offering as an extension to the community. And so through this time, one of the ways that we've sort of expanded the use of our facility while it was empty was during, our lobby is currently a staging area for mutual aid. So we're storing a lot of supplies and resources that are frequently being distributed out to the community in the area as needed. We also have been we're able to store supplies and equipment for documentary filmmakers and journalists who were out on the ground documenting what was happening specifically during the protests. And so these are a few of the ways that specifically, like in a moment, our space was being used physically. But that comes with a lot of the proximity to the East Precinct is, I think, a major concern and consideration in terms of who feels comfortable and welcome on that block alone. You can't walk down the sidewalk in front of the East Precinct right now. So there are lots of real physical barriers in addition to all of the other culturally constructed barriers that prevent people from being able to overcome the emotional burdens and the emotional barriers of even like coming into our neighborhood, let alone stepping foot into a physical space. And I think with that, to your question of what does it mean to occupy a space in the city right now, like that's one of our responsibilities as an arts organization. We're very intentionally co-curating what happens in that space. We very intentionally build our relationships with community groups, with organizations, with individual artists, with entities that are not necessarily registered entities, because we know there's a divide there as well in terms of who has access to space as a registered nonprofit or a registered institutional entity versus a community group that's come together to bring something to their constituents. And so we're a small team, and I think one of our strengths is in our ability to stay fluid and nimble, and we've been able to adapt to just sort of put our ears to the ground and listen and say, okay, what do people need from us right now? Let's do that. And I recognize that not every arts organization has that capacity or that ability or those resources, and we're definitely stretched. But I think it's part of our mission, and it's in service to the communities that we are a part of right now.
I mean, while we are talking now, there is an eviction going on here in Berlin, a queer feminist house project in Liebigstraße 34, Liebig Street 34. So it's like when we talk about like a battle, for example, or a protest, it's so vague, but actually you are facing sometimes also police violence and state violence coming into your spaces. So I was back in 2012 reporting from the US, and I was in Seattle. It was a rainy time. That's what I remember most. But I was reporting about the Occupy movement, actually. And I just read my text from back then, and the activists were focusing especially on the housing problem. And I was wondering how the protests from back then are connected to what we see and read today. Were these protests somehow sustainable, or would you say it's separated and the Occupy movement, that was something else?
I'd say that they're related in a sense, but it's at that time the Occupy movement was triggered by the developments on Wall Street in Manhattan, right? And so it was again going back to the crash of 2008, and the fact that millions of Americans lost their homes, which is often the only source of wealth for the middle classes, particularly, and then of course that most Americans, 50% of Americans, don't have any kind of wealth to speak of, and this kind of inequality stuck out, and people are trying to address it, and housing is the front line of that issue. But then the next cycle of protests, the current one right now is from George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter. But again, the issues about inequality, the fact of police, the questioning about what is the function of the police, essentially, which is the protection of property. And then you say, well, who has property? Well, a lot of Black people don't have property, and so they're not protecting us. They're protecting those who do have land or do have investments, and so forth and so on. And that protection is expressed through violence and so forth and so on. So there is that similarity. We haven't left. In fact, the situation got worse since 2012 in Seattle, and so. Again, we're back to this issue, right there when the protests occurred. It was interesting that they didn't use downtown primarily. They came to Capitol Hill, where a lot of the properties are now geared towards, there was a growth of what they call luxury condominiums or luxury apartments and so forth and so on. All over the neighborhood, they removed a bunch of old buildings and, and so forth and so on. And of course changed the character of the neighborhood. It became mostly about catering to developers, right? And their own goal, which is always to make a return as fast as possible on a loan that they receive to build these buildings, right? And so forth and so on. So they're going to jack up the prices everywhere that they can in order to meet those demands and so forth and so on. So we're stuck here. almost at the same place we were, but we added now police brutality to as well as inequality, right? Income inequality. And so they're the same. But right now, what's happening, and I don't see, I mean, it's really hard for me to see the future from this point. I mean, it's interesting that we're in a pandemic, and then things are sort of accelerated by the pandemic, meaning that the distance between those who don't and those who have things is accelerating, right? It's expanding at a faster and faster rate. And then you have that problem. Then you have this other issue that was already in process in 2012, beginning, actually, you could say around 2008, we have gone through this massive structural transformation of the spaces of our city. So in a sense, our city was once had the wealthy, or those who are white, were outside, predominantly outside. They were in the suburbs, and those people of color and so forth and so on were inside. So if you look at neighborhoods like I live in, Columbia City was once a multi, what is it called, a majority minority neighborhood, right? Mm-hmm. There was no majority here. It was Black, Asian, and Filipino. I mean, Filipino and Asian, but it was completely mixed. And then the same was true for Capitol Hill and all these neighborhoods. And so there were sort of like this was not the usual structure for a city, for an urban space. This only happened because of white flight in the 1960s, that suddenly we had poverty concentrated usually inside the city and money outside. After 2008, there was this restructuring where almost like the usual city, like the European city, or even like Paris, where now you're having the suburbs becoming more and more diverse and the inner city becoming more and more white. And so this is like almost as if we're reverting to an older spatial form, you know what I mean, in our city. And to me, so if this is structurally the issue, I know you mentioned the structural racism. It's a consequence of that. I mean, it's built because race is a part of our economic life, right? So it's going to be expressed racially. So what you find out right now, I mean, even in my neighborhood, which is in the South, it is becoming whiter, and so people have to move further out. And when you pass South Seattle in this direction, you end up in places like Renton, which is where now a lot of the Black churches have opened, or Burien and so forth and so on, and those are becoming new battlegrounds again, because capital is fleeing further and further, looking for juicy investments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna add to that and say that it was all planned, right? I've talked to urban planners who said it's called like the Great Urban Retraction, right? And so they're not going to be building more hospitals and et cetera resources, getting you electricity way, way, way far out. And so they started selling to people in the suburbs to come buy a condo downtown and on the waterfront, and you can live in a walkable city, and you can walk to the grocery store. And all of this was actually intentional.
When was this?
I think this has been about 20 years in the works. So when you talk to urban planners, they've been saying, like I said, like when people were moving out to suburbs, they thought they were going to have, they were going to have all these things, and they stopped making all those resources, and they started concentrating the resources back into the cities, right? And it was a way to bring people who were out back in, which also displaced folks. And I think that's interesting to note. I also wanted to note that I do think that Occupy movement and the Black Lives Matter movement right now are connected, in particular in a city like Seattle, because race has separated people by class, right? So what we know is that poor white folks and poor Black folks won't work together because race tells white folks that they're still better and they have the opportunity for the American dream, right? And I think we're realizing at the fall of capitalism, is what we're in right now, there's white folks realizing that American dream is actually not real for them, that they'll never actually get that through capitalism, and that it actually works in their favor to work with Black and brown folks to kind of dismantle and reimagine the system. And I think some people have that analysis, not everybody. There's some people newer on the continuum, but I think some people are realizing that the real culprit of a lot of our issues is capitalism, and that we need to work together.
Just a reminder for all the viewers, if you want to ask a question, just feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section. I don't know if Rana, if you want to add something to that.
I think jumping off of what you're saying about capitalism and sort of reimagining what our futures can look like outside of this structure, that's been one of the most beautiful parts of working in collaboration with my team at Northwest Film Forum to reimagine what can an organization do in true balance and collaboration and co-curation with community partners. What does it mean to open up our doors and to say yes to every idea that comes our way because it's expressing a need? If someone comes and says, we need this space in order to be able to present this program because it is important to our community for these reasons, there's no reason for us to not support that. And so, much to the chagrin of my very small team and the very many hours that we work already, we end up taking on a lot of these opportunities to grow our network and to explore what it really means to be sharing that kind of power, to be sharing that kind of responsibility of bringing something, creating something together that is by the community and truly for the community. So I always, when I think outside of the capitalism box, I immediately go to what do collectives look like? What does co-ownership look like? How can we challenge the patriarchal capitalist structure and create a system that actually works for us, where we're supporting one another. And we're all starting here in the same space, where we're starting from a place of collaboration and openness. And this is a hard structure to develop within those confines. As nonprofit arts organizations, we're often, every organization is spending staff resources and time and energy to write and apply for the same types of grants, to do the same types of administrative work. Our needs are similar. And if we can develop ways cross-organizationally and a system that is interdependent, I should say. And this is me getting into my utopic, what would I do if we could all live in communes and everything was rainbows and butterflies, but not quite. It can't be that far off. And so that's really internally what we're striving to do is where can we go to the edges of our imagination? What can we envision being possible within the confines, of course, because we have limits, but within the confines of what we have access to with our organization, how far can we take it and what's possible?
Yeah, there's a thing that I want to point out that's really important about this issue of allies, and I like to always bring it up again because Seattle it used to be a working class city, and it's not a working class city anymore. But there was a big, if I understand correctly, in Germany, there was an interest, at least at the political level, to keep costs of housing down, right? Because it means that otherwise wages have to go up, right? So if you're going to remain competitive as an industrial powerhouse, you have to have workers. You have to keep costs of living low enough that wages remain low as well, right? And in a sense, Samuel Stein in the book Capital City sort of brought this question up in a similar way. I mean, Seattle right now, all these kinds of working class jobs have vanished, right? So in a sense, there isn't really a need to form alliances, even at a political level, with the concerns of the working class. It's easy just to move them away because there isn't a reason why you'd want to keep wages low, or as a consequence, or as a kind of tactic, keep housing prices low. So that there's no business incentive at all in Seattle to do this. And I don't think that is not at all unrelated to the fact that Boeing is pulling out of this region, right? And going to South Carolina, I think this is related. We just don't have the working classes. Even when I mean working classes now, I'm not talking about 25,000 or 30. I'm actually talking more like 70 to 80,000, right? Is now within that range, that they don't have the kind of political might that they had a long time ago. And this creates all sorts of pressures locally. It means that homeowners become incredibly defensive about their only asset, which is their house, right? So they want to protect the value of those houses because they have nothing else going. Wages aren't increasing. There's no political support for them at the top. And, you know, as pointed out, I mean, there should be a tighter political relationship between the working classes and the middle classes of every color in the city, because actually, if you look at it, despite the fact we have a very liberal, a very progressive city council, we're still not making any grounds. You know, that political power is not being translated into economic results.
It's the same situation in Berlin. Just continue.
So I wanted to point that out. That yeah, we just don't have that alliance. But yes, go ahead. Sorry, let's have to say that.
No. I just wanted to again, like, say from my Berlin perspective, you might say there is a lefty progressive government in the city, but still nothing really happens. Yes, there is this law passed about the caps, for example, and there is a lot of discussion about homelessness, but still you see the problem in the city. And sometimes, I mean, critical views on capitalism, sometimes they sound very vague, but it's, as a person, I don't drive, for example, and when I'm in the US, I just understand what it means to be a poor and then also racialized person and live in the suburb, for example, where you don't have a good public transportation. It's like this kind of very specific questions. They shape lives, actually. Then you would live maybe in a food desert. Then you have an automotive industry which is lobbying with billions of dollars, so you cannot have a bus connection or a tram connection or a metro connection, and so on and so on. So this is like a very interesting discussion we're having also, because Seattle. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I have to point out one quick thing, and this was brought up earlier. It's really important. It's the urbanists are the problem. You see, we actually are increasing our public transportation system. We actually are improving it. But the funny thing is, it's the benefits are going to the whites who are moving into the city. Whereas the poor are moving out to these transport deserts where they're more and more dependent on cars, and so they're going to lose in every sense of the way. They're going to lose, you know, in terms of like health results and all that sort of stuff. But no, actually, Seattle is building for the first time a really, you know, substantial light rail system, but nobody of color will be here to take advantage of it, right? It's going to be for the tech workers primarily. That's what's going to happen. And so here we have it. I mean, walkability, and this is what I call contentless urbanism. It's a problem. We have this urbanism that came out of the 80s. And it didn't have all the values were all about walkability, bike tracks, you know, transportation, minimizing car transportation, and so on and so on, and benefits of density. And there was all this talk, and it was great. And it came out of this sort of Jane Jacobs tradition. But when it went through the grind, the economic grind, the results were what we see now is that the poor are the ones who are left with these poorly planned cities. The rich get to enjoy the benefits of a Jane Jacobs-like city with parks, with clean air, with public transportation, with bikes, and so forth and so on.
There's actually someone commenting from the audience that there is a little concern for the consequences for communities of color. I don't know if that person lives in Seattle, but it's actually a phenomenon that you can see in a lot of major cities in the US and also here in Europe. I wanted to talk a little bit about Carl Anderson Park, if that's okay for you, because we saw some pictures here also in Germany. And there are some headlines from the last couple of weeks. We lost Charles, I think, but he will come back. I just want to read some headlines from the last couple of weeks, like woman killed in Seattle Park, man found dead nearby. Another headline says 16 protesters arrested after graffiti, dispersal order, explosives thrown towards officers. Another headline says hundreds attend worship protests, maskless in the park. Then Seattle hires armed private security to patrol Carl Anderson Park, and the homeless camp is cleaned up. So I was wondering, maybe you can describe to us what is
qualified person to talk about any of this. Yeah, everybody wants to talk about the Chaz chop, and I think it's complex in a lot of ways, right? So there are critiques about how there are black led protests that were happening around the city, and the protests that were happening in Capitol Hill were mostly white led. So there's some of that, but I think there's some history around that precinct in particular. That precinct, the city was trying to put it in the central district, right? The city's historically redlined black neighborhood. It's more than black, but we're just going to be simplified here. And the community protested because they were not going to let the city actually put a precinct right in the community, right? Like, and so they put it in the next parcel property as close to the central district as possible, which is Capitol Hill. So there's this historical precedence even around that facility and what it means for the community. And then, I think Seattle has always had an interesting protest history. So creating an autonomous zone in a lot of ways is quite interesting.
Okay, everyone, we seem to be having some connection issues. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we all seem to have dropped out at one point, and I managed to get back on. But it looks like only Elisheba and I are left. And Elisheba, unfortunately, since I was kicked out too, I didn't hear your last statement, but I can see we have some more questions. So maybe, I'm not sure if we got to that one already, but then maybe you can already elaborate on that one. So one of the questions.
Yeah, really all I was saying is that I'm not qualified to talk about the Chaz chop. I think there are people that were living and breathing it every day, and it's quite complex, but it's just a very complex situation. So what I do know is that there were some businesses that were supportive of the Chaz chop. There were some that were not because of noise or the violence that was happening. I also know people who reached out to me that lived around the Chaz chop that felt like it was a Black movement that was being co-opted. So some of the police presence that Mohamed talked about is kind of people retaking the space and kind of protecting it, protecting property and things like that, whether or not you agree with it or not. So that is probably where I will leave it in terms of people understanding a little bit about what happened this last summer.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it looks like we have a few people back now. So Mohamed is back.
I'm back.
Rana is back. I think we still lost Charles, but Mohamed, I hand it back to you. So Elisheba basically just finished the last the statement she made before everyone dropped out of the line.
Okay. So there was this question that I saw before. There's Rana back. I
just want to say with with all of this getting kicked off of Zoom, I think a lot lately about the digital spaces that we're occupying and who the gatekeepers are for these, behind the scenes, the conversations that we're able to have in these spaces, and just being completely disconnected for multiple times now. This has never happened in my, what is it now, 6 to 8 month history with Zoom. And this is certainly one of the more political conversations that I've been a part of on this platform. So I say that just to state, we're never in a neutral space.
Yeah.
And so I want to take that into consideration as we're having our conversations as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know if Elisheba can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yes, great. Let's talk while we can. There is the question that you were describing the city planning cycle that was done 20 years ago. And there is a question, what solutions do you propose for the next 20 years? We were talking a little bit also about the utopic visions, how to build like a very, how to build up a solidarity in a community, in a city where you have this housing problem, where you have the racial inequality. But if you could maybe explain your vision for the next 20 years cycle in Seattle, what would you do?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, right now, as a collective and an arts organization, we're looking at zoning policy. So, like I said, there's been some kind of policy around, in not just the central district, but in other kind of areas in the city, mostly diverse, that has allowed for density to happen. And it's really pro-developer. But what would that look like if it was centered on community and the community needs? So I think there are activists working on that from many different fashions of how do they reclaim affordable space and housing for folks. And I think, and also like, how do we use zoning policy in our favor? So in particular with Wa Na Wari, we are in a single family house, but we just got rezoned recently, yay, into a community center. And so we're looking, part of a project that we have called Case 21 that is looking at the needs of Black homeowners and the needs of Black cultural workers. But through that work, there will be a survey that goes out. And we're looking at maybe there's ways that Black homeowners could look at the current zoning laws or policies and use them in their favor, right? Not just developers' favor. So if they want to set up an ADU in their backyard, which ADUs have been a solution that we've been talking about as a country, but they've been cost prohibitive and something that really only the rich have been able to access and really implement. So we are also thinking of ways that people can bring in extra income to offset their things like their property taxes or do upgrades to their homes and be able to keep their homes and age in place. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about, is really like looking at the policy landscape and what needs to be changed, what needs to be fixed, or how can we bend the rules in our favor to really meet the needs of community, I guess would be my answer to that question.
There's a question which is related to what you said. Within the context of the American-style hyper-capitalism tradition, how likely is it for a society that is conditioned to admire that capitalism tradition be able to effectively break away and re-envision a new socio-economic framework? So how to get out of this American idea that everybody needs to try to make as much money as possible. I'm trying to paraphrase it in my own words, and try to be as inclusive as possible. Maybe Rana, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, you know, it's the question of how likely is it is a challenging one. I think for me and everything I do, it starts at a grassroots level. It starts with the individual, and so if we on an individual basis can take on the responsibility of recognizing the shortcomings of the system in which we live and recognizing how we're complicit in it, that's a very baseline starting point, is acknowledging our position and our power within that system. And then if we really want change, then it's a matter of step by step and action by action. And I don't believe that there's any single person who wants change in this world that is alone in that in the change that they want to see. I think it's really a matter of then being able to mobilize together, to become local, to be able to share ideas, to go back to what we were talking about earlier about having these political spaces that are safe spaces for us to come together and share and explore. And, you know, I wasn't able to speak specifically to Cal Anderson and the CHOP in that last question, but what the CHOP really served as was a place for a collective to form, a collective of ideas to be generated. And that collective is in existence and is moving into the future. And, you know, it's made up of humans, just like you and me, who came together and said, we won't stand for this anymore. We won't stand for these murders. We won't stand for this brutality. We won't stand for all of the injustices that we're facing. And so we're going to come together and do something about it. And it has to be recognized, I think, that we have to start on an individual level by looking into ourselves and our roles within it. And if we can do that, I do believe that change is possible. We've seen over time that change is possible. We may not be quite where we want to be yet, and that's why we keep going.
That's very beautiful, but at the same time, there is one or a lot of powerful people trying to oppose exactly this. And there is the question from Julia Pataki. She's asking, what are your hopes for the current situation in the US, especially regarding the protests against police brutality and racism, and the denial of the existence of racism in the US by the president? And I would add another question. Donald Trump actually commented on the protest happening in Seattle and other cities. And what is this doing with the idea that you just described, Rana, of coming together and trying to build something new?
Right. So one example is the county put there was a bill to build a youth achievement center. And that youth achievement center was actually a youth jail that cost over $2 million or something crazy. And I'm probably getting the number wrong. It's probably even more than that. But there have been activists for years and years and years protesting, saying, and it was the No Youth Jail movement. After the prolonged protests that were sparked by George Floyd, but obviously many others like Breonna Taylor and et cetera, our King County executive came out a couple weeks ago and said he was going to shut down the jail. So did he shut down the jail because of the protests? No, he did it. It was because of the work of the organizers who've been doing this for years, that because of the protests was able to intersect and show, have enough political pressure to actually make that move. We're seeing people have been trying to defund the police and fund public safety for a long time. The political pressure is making that happen, but it's only being able to happen, like I said, because people have been doing this work for a long time. So I actually think that Rana is right. There are people who are envisioning a better future, have been, and this is a moment where we're able to go meet with policymakers and try and see if they can push things forward while the door is open.
One way is meeting with policymakers, but the other way is just abolishing everything and rethinking it from the scratch, basically. And I read an article by Charles, who is back and hopefully who can hear us. Great.
I can hear you. Sorry, I got knocked off. I did not know what happened.
We don't know what happened. But we were talking and trying. I also was kicked out several times. We are talking about alternatives, and I just read a very interesting article you wrote, Charles, in The Stranger, about anarchists in the city, which is like the most un-American thing I can think of. Basically, anarchy. It's something I don't know. I cannot imagine in the US somehow, just from this German perspective, reading the news coming out, at least from Washington, D.C., for example. So maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that? And is this...
Yeah. You know, it goes back to the issue of like the recent protests in trying to dilute some of the unity, or to like not or to make it less cohesive, or what they've done is they've tried to pinpoint a lot of, like Portland, for example, the activism there. They've tried to say like it's really some disgruntled white youth, right, and not really them responding to the crisis of policing in the United States. And so they focused on anarchism as a kind of way to discredit the links that are being made between different groups with different with different, usually different political projects, right, or different approaches to trying to solve housing, trying to solve inequality, trying to solve state oppression, and so forth and so on. And so what happened is they tried to like identify they've tried to identify the protests as unrelated to Black Lives Matter, right? And I think that was the first sort of approach. And so they're trying to, in that way they can like they can bring in federal forces and also demonize political activities in cities and so forth and so on. The advantage for that, weirdly enough, has been those who try to take advantage of that have been those on the far right, and who have seen the city as in opposition to their ethical views and whatever they have and so forth and so on. And that's been, and so it's not, I wish it was something deeper and a little more crafty, but it's more of this kind of like, the last thing they want to believe, or the last thing they want to happen, are linkages formed between different kinds of political projects within the city. I mean, this is what's taking place in Seattle, and but anarchism has been with us forever. I mean, it's almost like as old as the hills. I have no idea why it is. You know, I know why there's an attention to it, but it's nothing new at all. And part of the music scene, particularly, and for those who say it's un-American, I mean, the anarchist movement is not that. If you go back into the 80s, I mean, that was probably the dominant street for white kids. The dominant form of political expression was a complete rejection of the state and state power, right? And sometimes it would flow into libertinism, right, and that sort of thing. But that's what I sort of have. That's sort of my view of it. But it's a joke. It's a total joke because the city is still run by the rich, and they still determine the politics, and they're still driving up housing values. So there isn't really a threat as such, you know, unless you want to invent reasons for increasing policing, you know what I mean, displacement and so forth and so on.
Which is leading us, we have 14 more minutes. Let's see if Zoom will let us talk 14 more minutes, which would lead us to the question of Eva Karaha. She is asking, what do the panelists find to be a way to improve the situation for housing and economics in Seattle and other areas in the US? Do we need to make political change? How is this done in Berlin as a comparison? Just very quickly about Berlin, we already discussed the law about the caps, about the maximum rent in the city. There is an initiative from the city. You have to know that housing is it's not a federal thing, it's like a local question. Mm-hmm. So the city of Berlin really is the one who is in charge here, and the decision makers who are part of a more lefty government, a progressive government, if you would ask them, they are trying to build more buildings, more housing. That's their key strategy. Yeah. But it's not working.
It doesn't work.
Actually. It's not working. There are other strategies, but I would love to hear from you if you observe, if you say, Charles, it doesn't work. Do you have the same problem in Seattle?
Yeah, well, that's what the urbanists were trying to tell us, is that we're going to build our way out of this trouble, right? They say they actually imagined that the housing crisis was an economic law issue, right? The economic law in question being that of supply and demand, and that if you built more, that would cause the prices of housing to fall. This was a fantasy, right? It was never going to work. The big problem is I've yet to see how excessive growth solves anything in capitalism. And so to me, the issue is not so much that we have a demand or supply issue at work. The issue is more of how do we live without the pressure of the growth logic, right? How do we escape the idea that, you know, that there's certain people in the world who feel their portfolios are meaningless unless they're growing at 4% a year, right? How do we escape out of that determination, right? And so right now, you know, most people don't mind slow growth. It's not as bad as people make it out to be, but we're driven or we're organized or orchestrated. Our lives are by people who feel that life is meaningless unless they're growing at a clip. The economy is growing at a clip and compounded, you know, compound interest and, you know, compound growth. I mean, which is even more insane. But we haven't left this logic of of capitalist expansion. And so that's what I would say. That's what I would say is the problem.
Yeah.
You know, we have to, yeah.
We didn't even really touch on Seattle's homeless, you know, epidemic. I don't want to call it a problem necessarily, but people have done research and said that the our particular homeless situation that we're in right now is not what people think about necessarily. There definitely are people who are experiencing, you know, mental illness and other things like that. But the majority of the reason our homeless population has spiked is the unaffordability of housing. So it's a lot of people that you wouldn't know were homeless. They're now in rotating shelters because I know people who actually work at Amazon, you know, in the warehouse, who were living in a shelter because $12 an hour was not enough for them to get an apartment. So that's another factor of kind of like the complexities of, I think what Charles is talking about is that there are people who want to fix the homeless problem in Seattle by just sweeping camps and making it go away without looking structurally about what is happening in the city to make it rapid at this moment. And, you know, I'll just give like a little antidote. So I was looking for apartments a couple of years ago. I've been priced out of the city as well. I live at my father's house, and which is the house I grew up in, just like Rana. But I was looking for places a couple of years ago, and I hadn't been on the market in a while. And so I would go to these apartments and they would say, well, this is the quote for today. And I was like, what do you mean this is the quote for today? And they'd be like, oh, the housing, the price of this apartment changes every day. So this is good for 48 hours. And then you have to.
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
How is that possible? How is that even a thing?
I couldn't believe it myself. So that's what we're dealing with, is that they can raise the prices daily of an apartment based on what they think the market will bear.
Yeah. Because it's somebody will always have more money than you in this city. That's bizarre. That's how it always feels like. But she's right to talk about the housing crisis exploded, and it's even gotten worse, particularly after the pandemic. But basically, we've had it since the 1980s. I also blame the destruction. It was less so in Seattle, but more so in places like Chicago, and also Georgia. Not near Atlanta, Georgia, but it was the destruction of the public housing stock that occurred. I mean, we had a little bit of it in Seattle. The Hope 6 movement came in the 1990s. There was this notion that suddenly that the source of the problem was concentrating poverty, and so they got all worked up about this, and then they set up to destroy large sections of public housing within cities. In our city, it was the Yesla Terrace, and it was this notion that they could, like, the promise that they would bring back the people into what they call mixed income housing, which is a lot of nonsense, really. I mean, and it's also quite insulting because they're saying that because when you have poor people living together, it's a terrible situation. They don't have the ability to work or to accrue the values needed to thrive in market conditions. So what we're going to do is disperse them and then make them live with middle class people, and therefore absorb these values that are somehow lacking in poor communities. We actually had that as a urban policy framework from the 90s until it crashed in the 90s, until it crashed just as Obama came into power, because it was revealed that these things were just disrupting communities. They weren't building anything. They weren't strengthening or all of that sort of stuff. And about 30% of those people who were displaced so that they could have these mixed income projects built, set in different parts of the city, about 30% ended up on the street. In all these projects, I was surprised in Portland, in Seattle, in Minneapolis, when they destroyed public housing, 30% at an average wound up straight on the street. And so we have this huge housing crisis because basically we don't have what you call affordable housing. That does not exist. They talk about affordable housing. It's like there's no such thing. We don't know who. Affordable housing means different things to different people. And so we don't have this universal template that is realistic about what they mean by affordable housing. And you're right. I mean, working at Amazon, at the warehouses, there's no way you're going to make enough money to live in the city. And we, by the way, have one of the highest minimum wage levels in the United States of America. And it's a far cry from what's needed.
To add to that.
To add something, yes.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I think you wanted to add something.
Well, I just wanted to say, the reality that minimum wage and affordable housing do not coexist. Like this phrase is so stuck in my brain, and it's painful to think about how there's not a single place in the country where minimum wage workers can afford to rent a 1 or 2 bedroom home without working the impossible hours that don't exist in a single 24-hour day. And so that reality is really potent. So I appreciate Charles for highlighting that. There's something else I want to share, but I want to hear what your question is first, Mohamed.
No, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to also share, on a more positive note or a hopeful note, sort of in response to Ava's earlier question about, what kind of change can we envision? The city, so Seattle, out of Seattle's race and social justice initiative, there has been developed a cohort essentially called Build Art Space Equitably. And this is a space, it's like a 12-month cohort program where that was launched in direct response to the concerns around the gentrification that communities of color are experiencing. And so it's a cohort that brings together cultural professionals from BIPOC communities and real estate professionals. And it's based around sort of bridging this gap and creating spaces of learning and knowledge around the intersection of art and development and real estate. So when we think about like what kind of change is possible, I do want to point to, again, this feels like a grassroots effort, right? Like it's a collective of 15 to 20 individuals who are coming together and learning about the ins and outs of the system in order to then go back and contribute to a more equitable system overall. So, so these are the types of, I think, grassroots programs that I'm referencing when I say we need to like bond together with the people that are like-minded and create momentum together. So there are small efforts that I think over the long term, and we have to be open to the possibility that not everything will be resolved in our lifetime. We have to be open to understanding and embracing that what we're contributing to now will inform and benefit the generations to come. And that can be a hard thing as individuals to accept, but that's a big part of it.
An amazing way to close our panel. I'm very, very sorry about the technical problems, but I really, really enjoyed, despite of the Zoom thing, I enjoyed our conversation, and I would love to stay in touch with you. Thank you so much for your contributions, and hopefully see you soon in Seattle than in person. Yes. And if you're in Berlin, just let me know. We can go for a walk, and I show you a lot of favorite places.
Yes. I love Berlin, by the way. I haven't been there since 2013, but I love the city.
The city is amazing. Of course, now with the coronavirus, it's very tough for a lot of authors, artists, but also like the people who struggle on a daily basis. At the same time, if I compare it to the situation in most American cities, it's still heaven somehow here. So in this sense, please stay safe. And let me just say a last thing. You can join us next time on the 28th of October at a brand new talk of radical diversity, then with Max Czollek, and in Mexico City, virtually in Mexico City. We will discuss borders and walls, and some of the panelists will be the curator Violeta Horcasitas and the artists Clara Bolivar and Ali Cotero. Thank you so much for your patience, and see you soon, I hope. Bye, Seattle.
Thank you. Bye.
Gute Nacht. Bis bald. Tschüss.